Welcome everybody to this special session. My name is Becca Whitla, and I'm the secretary of the Hymn Society. And I'm just delighted to be diving into this third full day of the conference. It's my deep pleasure to introduce our two leaders right now, who are both recognized international concertizers on the organ. Dr. Sunghee Kim is the assistant professor of organ and church music at Valparaiso University. She's, as I mentioned, an accomplished and prize-winning organist, has given concerts in the USA, South Korea, and Europe. And her colleague, Dr. Kartika Putri, they both studied at Indiana University, which I understand is where they met. And Dr. Putri is the worship and music minister at Good Shepherd Lutheran Church in, I don't know if I'm going to pronounce this correctly, Wausau, Wisconsin. Is that right? Yeah, okay. She's also involved in the American Guild of Organists and the Association of Lutheran Church Musicians, and herself has performed in the USA, Germany, France, and Indonesia, where she was born. She published a music handbook called Come to Us, Creative Spirit, a practical guide for congregational education and outreach through music ministry. Both of them together are going to dive into the conference theme with a session called Bind Us Together, Building Bridges Between People of All Cultures. Welcome, Dr. Putri and Dr. Kim. I really look forward to learning from you.
Music and director of the chapel. Hello everyone, welcome to today's session. I am Sunghee Kim, assistant professor of music and director of the chapel music at Valparaiso University in Indiana.
And my name is Kartika Putri, and I serve as minister of worship and music at Good Shepherd Lutheran Church in Wausau, Wisconsin. We are so honored to present our session as part of this convention. The title of this session is Bind Us Together, Building Bridges Between People of All Cultures. We believe that we are all made in the image of God, and that this richness of God's creation can be celebrated in our life together as the church through music ministry. In a nutshell, the outline of this session is as follows. First, we're going to discuss the motivation, background, and purpose of this project. And we'll discuss our identity. Who am I? Who are you? Who are we? Then we'll listen to the voices of people of different backgrounds and cultures. Then we'll discuss about music. Does it really have the power to unite people? And finally, so what? What can we do? How can we use our music ministry platform to embrace each other? For this project, we have interviewed a few church leaders and musicians from various ethnic backgrounds. And throughout this session, we are going to share our stories as well as theirs. By doing this, we hope that we can explore creative ways to embrace people who may look different from us, and also to build relationship with people of different cultures through music and the platform of music ministry. We will also ask you to think about your own experiences and to ask questions. So we ask you to have a notebook or a sheet of paper and pencil with you to write your thoughts down.
Motivation, background, and purpose of this project. After having professional careers in the church music field, people who looked like me and who have similar background to mine reached out to me, shared the difficulties they were facing, and asked for my advice. These people's stories and questions reminded me that I also had very similar experiences, and I am still struggling with those issues. One of the main issues that we are still struggling with is the sense of belonging in American societies, especially in Christian faith communities. All of us may have experiences in being marginalized as well as being welcomed in communities. For international people and people in minority groups, The sense of belonging could impact heavily on their daily lives, as well as their perceptions of themselves and others. To understand how people, especially minority people, are forming their sense of belonging at churches, we conducted interviews with church musicians with various cultural and ethnic backgrounds, and also ministers who have been working with marginalized people. For Christians, welcoming all people is not an optional task, but a biblical mandate. We can find how God wants us to welcome and serve strangers and foreigners from the scriptures. Do not neglect to show hospitality to strangers, for by doing that, some have entertained angels without knowing it. The alien who resides with you shall be to you as the citizen among you. You shall love the alien as yourself, for you were aliens in the land of Egypt. I am the Lord your God. Do not mistreat or oppress a foreigner, for you were foreigners in Egypt.
In a time where so many people choose to focus on differences, we musicians are called to unite and find commonalities that make us all human. I often told the musicians with whom I minister that sometimes making music together is hard, not because of the technicalities of it, but because we have to be willing to be vulnerable, not only for the sake of the music, but also for the sake of connecting with one another, to be in it together. So when Sunghee invited me to work on this project together, the very thing that I just shared with you impassioned me to continue this conversation, to listen and learn from people's stories, and hopefully we can help build bridges between people of all cultures. Section 2, who am I? Who are you? Who are we?
Living in the US as an Asian with strong accents have made me think about identity quite often, which I would have not thought about if I live in my home country. One of the questions that I am asked most is, where are you from? Though this is a very common question for icebreaking, it may also have deeper meanings underneath them. My answer was simple in my early years in the US. Korea. Nowadays, it is not quite easy for me to answer because I have been living in many different places in the US past 15 years, besides my home country. Kartika, are you also asked this question, where are you from, often?
Yeah, for sure. And like you, honestly, it was so much easier to answer this question when I first moved to a new country, like when I moved to Australia or when I moved to the US, or even when I studied abroad in Germany, because I would just refer to my country of origin at the time. And right now, this question is harder and harder for me to answer, partly because I have lived in the US longer than I've lived in Indonesia, but also because I have dissociated myself from the culture and traditions of my parents and country of origin in many ways, I think. So when people ask me this question in recent years, I would just tell them that I am from wherever I reside at the time. Like right now, I would say I'm from Wasa. Until someone asked me, where are you really from? Then I would tell them where I grew up.
Well, thank you, Kartika. Actually, you are the one who made me think about this question even more and deeper. Like you, nowadays, I tell other people that I am from Valparaiso, Indiana, and originally from South Korea. Well, now we know that where are you from question may have some limitations for certain people to introduce themselves. So, besides the where are you from question, Kartika and I tried to find better questions to let our interviewees introduce themselves freely. So we began the interviews with this question: how do you describe or how do you identify yourself? First, let us introduce ourselves on our own terms. while we are introducing ourselves, we also want to encourage you to write down some keywords or vocabularies that describe you. I may describe myself with those keywords: organist, musician, former international student, teacher, Korean, partially Americanized Korean, Asian female, foreigner, immigrant, and sojourner. I was born and raised in Seoul, Korea until graduating a college. I came to the US in 2003 to pursue my graduate studies. Since then, I studied organ at graduate schools and have been working as a teacher, organist, and music director in the US. That means I began my adult life and professional life in the US. I was surrounded by many Korean students and international students at the graduate schools. However, once I began working as a music professional, my working environments are always white American dominated. I don't doubt this environment forms me in certain ways that may be different from traditional Korean adults. I still don't think I am American or Asian American, but I am sure I am partially or mainly Americanized. Kartika, could you introduce yourself? How do you want to describe yourself?
Yeah, actually, I'm going to use my friend's words in describing myself today, that I am more or less an independent soul. If I have to label myself with something, I'd say that I am a globalized Asian. I mentioned earlier that I grew up in Indonesia, but my grandparents and extended family members are migrants from China. So I have always had that hyphenated identity that at one point I decided not to tie myself to too much. When you see me, you can physically see that I have Asian features. However, having been an artist all my life, having lived in different parts of the world and befriended people from across the globe, I think that I have adapted so many of the cultures, traditions, and values that I've encountered in the journey that made me me. All right, now that you heard about how we identify ourselves, we are going to share our interviewees' answers to this question. A little disclaimer, throughout this session, you will hear our interviewees' stories. Please keep in mind that all the interview questions were reviewed by the Institutional Review Board, and this project as a whole was approved by the IRB as well. We are also going to share our interviewees' stories and experiences with their consent. We will use pseudonyms or fake names to protect their identities.
So, when we ask this question in our interviewees, how do you describe yourself? Our interviewees describe themselves as African American male, independent soul, teacher, organist, musician, music director, white American, gay man, British female, Lutheran pastor, transracial adoptee, Korean, Americanized Korean, Canadian. We also have an interviewee who struggles with this question that it would take her almost half of an interview to identify herself as her own race as Asian. We learned later that she has had a traumatic experience related to her race, that answering this question was not as easy.
So as expected, these are quite diverse. Some describe themselves through the lens of ethnicity, some gender, and some occupation. We can see that how one answers this question can tell a lot about what is most important about themselves.
We cannot describe one's identities with only one word or hyphenated words, such as Asian American or African American. There are so many layers in us. However, the skin colors and accents in our speakings are bold and strong enough to cover all those deep and various layers in people and make those people as a mess titled strangers or foreigners. Then, What can we do to understand and get to know others better?
One of the most effective ways to understand others is through storytelling and careful listening. Even in the Genesis story and through our understanding of the Trinity, we believe that our God is the God of relationship, and God created us to be relational beings. Healthy relationships thrive on connecting with each other, telling and listening to each other's stories, empathizing with one another, and caring for one another. For this very reason, today we are amplifying some of the voices of minorities and church leaders with whom we have spoken through our interviews.
Voices of people of different backgrounds and cultures. We are going to share our own stories as well as stories of our interviewees about their experiences as visiting worshipers or newcomers in the church. As always, we would like you to think about your own experiences and write down your stories as well. Here are some of our interview questions for you to ponder. Tell us about your experiences as a visiting worshiper at the church.
All right, I'll go first. My experiences in visiting churches as a worshiper have actually been quite varied. There are times when I felt like I was invasive, and there are times when I felt like I was part of the family right from the start. As part of the assignments for one of the church music classes that I took in college, we had to visit a few churches of different denominations. Because I had a church job at the time, I ended up having to attend either Saturday or weekday services by myself instead of with a classmate. I think that we can all agree that most weekday services are more intimate. And as a visiting worshiper, I was definitely noticed. However, I also observed that while other worshipers noticed me, they avoided eye contact, even when I knew that they were looking at me at first. And after I tried to smile at them, they would smile back and then they looked away. My first two visits ended up in virtually no interaction with other worshipers, although the pastors in both churches were very welcoming and kind. So I ended up visiting the third church with a friend, and the interaction felt more positive. I think because he was a little bit more extroverted than I was, or at least that's what I thought. On another hand, though, I also had wonderful experiences as a visiting worshiper where I felt belonged instantly. One particular experience that had stuck with me was when I was visiting a local church on my day off here in Wausau. When I walked in, one of the greeters noticed that I was new there. She excitedly approached me and introduced herself. And everyone there wears a name tag, so she made me one. I was then ushered in with a family who invited me to sit with them. Honestly, while I do not remember the person's name who initiated this, that person is definitely one of my role models now. So how about you, Sunghee? Tell us about your experience.
I think my welcomed experiences are varied based on who I was sitting next to and who the music director at the church was. One time on my Sunday off, I visited a local church as a visiting worshiper. During the service, the sermon and bidding prayers were focused on justice and peace, especially peace for certain Asian countries, including my home country. I was so impressed and touched by the church's effort in seeking peace for Asian countries because the congregants of this small church were predominantly white Americans. I wanted to express my gratitude and appreciation to the church after the service. While I was sitting on the pew during the organ postlude, people near me began leaving the sanctuary. Other church members, pastors, and worship leaders were also leaving the church one by one. And finally, no one was near me at the end of the service. In the round-shaped sanctuary, people were probably able to notice the newcomers, Asians, visit during the 1-hour worship service. I was a bit saddened, but not surprised, because it happened many times when I visited other churches too. Though I often felt I became a stranger at churches, there were also many times that people welcomed me and took care of me without expecting anything in return. At the end of my doctoral program, I moved to the Philadelphia area. At the time, I was still working on my dissertation, looking for a new church job, and trying to adjust myself to this new city. I Googled the churches near me and began visiting those churches one by one until finding a church that I felt comfortable with. On one Sunday, I visited one of the churches on my list. After the service, a gentleman who was sitting next to me introduced himself to me first and asked me if it was my first time visiting this church. So I introduced myself as an organist. Then he said, "Oh, you are an organist. Do you want to meet our music director and organist?" He brought me to the church music director and introduced me to him. Then the music director greeted me and asked me a couple of questions gently that helped me expose myself more. Eventually, the music director invited me to choir rehearsals, helped me interact with the church members and choir members, and let me practice organ during weekdays. My one-time visit ended up being an unofficial but active church member for several months until I got a church job. I sang in the choir, sometimes rang the bells in the handbell choir, and also played organ occasionally as special music during the service. People already knew that I would leave the church soon once I got a job. However, they never treated me as a temporary church member or a foreigner. I am still thinking about how powerful the small talk was on my first visit.
Thank you for sharing, Sunghee. It seems that our experiences are actually quite similar. Well, now let's share our interview stories too.
Let me share Sam's story first. Sam is a music director, and he described himself as partially Americanized Korean. He was born in Korea and moved to the US about 20 years ago. About 3 years ago, he got a music director position at an American church, which is the very first and the only American church that he experienced. He told us that when he first began his work there, he had to try to be a part of the community. And he also felt the whole church tried to show their hospitality to him and his family. He said he immediately loved to be part of this church community. He experienced an extremely warm welcome at his current church. When his family first moved to that area, his apartment was still under construction. So he had to find a temporary place to stay. One of the church members offered to let him stay at his house until the apartment was ready for him to move in. This church member let Sam and Sam's family use the main bedroom, the master bedroom, for several months without expecting any gain.
Our next interviewee is an Asian adoptee who is raised in a German family through a Midwestern culture. Today, let's call him Frank. So Frank realized that in general, as an Asian person who does not fit the stereotypes, sometimes cultural differences can be an area of tension. He shared with us that sometimes it is not the look that people give him that makes him uncomfortable in a new place, but some of the comments made or questions asked. Comments such as, "Your English is really good," or "Are you from China?" or "Where are you really from?" assume that if you are part of the ethnic minority, you must be from a different country. This can be hurtful to those whose native language is English and who has lived in the United States all their lives. Of course, he had good experiences as well that he did not share in detail with us. And now, as a music director, he makes sure that everyone feels welcome in his choir and his church, especially newcomers. For our next story, we interviewed a person who identifies as a white male pastor. We call him Chris today. Chris shared that while he didn't think that he ever felt marginalized as a visiting worshiper, he had felt cultural tension when he was a newcomer at his first congregation, which was almost 100% Norwegian American. This church was also located in a place that was known as Little Norway because most of the people in that area are Americans of Norwegian descent. And this is a very interesting instance that because he looked like one of them, he was expected to understand the culture as well and would feel judged when he did not understand something that they did. Another story that Chris shared was not his experience at a church, but at a gathering of predominantly Black people that he attended when he was in college. He shared with us his inner battle in deciding whether or not he would attend after he actually got there. He wanted to be there for his best friend who invited him, who is Black, but as soon as he arrived at the event, he realized that he would be the only white man and would stand out in that company. Chris admitted that he was nervous about going into the venue and had secretly planned on going in, showed his friend that he was present, and then left as soon as possible. As soon as Chris went in, though, he was greeted very warmly and was treated very well by the family and those who were there, and ended up staying until the end of the event. He said that that particular experience had made him empathize with visiting worshipers and keep in mind the inner battle that newcomers might have in the parking lots of so many churches, especially if they look different.
Another experience that was shared with us is by an African American male organist and teacher. Today we will call him Anthony. Anthony's experiences as a visiting worshiper in the inner city where he grew up were mostly good. He also visited and played at various churches as a substitute organist as well. He shared that the first time he felt that he was treated differently was when he substituted at a church in a suburban area. Anthony shared a story of a person who would call another to ensure that they really did have a Black male lined up to play the organ. He also experienced this. When he came to practice, someone approached him and aggressively asked, "Can I have you?" at the church front door. Anthony said, the way that the question was asked and the gesture that the man used clearly showed that he didn't belong there. Anthony is a very talented organist in classical music as well as jazz. When he visited churches as a substitute organist, he got some comments that are not necessarily negative, but certainly demonstrate stereotypical assumptions about Anthony. For example, he was asked these questions: "We don't do that gospel stuff here." Or, "They started snapping fingers like this. Do you play jazz?" Anthony later said, however, that he has mostly felt welcomed as a church musician. For Anthony, he felt welcomed and embraced as a person when other people extended their hands for a handshake, showed that they were comfortable around him, and made an effort to learn how to pronounce his name correctly.
So we're going to interrupt the storytelling segment here for a minute. We hope that you have been writing down your thoughts and maybe think about how you have been treated as a visiting worshiper and newcomer, or have treated others when you are the host. I think that we can agree that welcoming others is more complex than we want to admit. Before telling their stories, all of our interviewees remind us that although they were sharing stories that may be uncomfortable, the people they talked about are still genuinely good people. So being gracious and forgiving of our own biases, are also part of the process.
Okay, then now let's talk about how we welcome others, as well as the complexity of our expectation for others when they welcome us. When we talk about how to welcome people, we also need to think about the various ways of welcoming people and also different styles of welcome in different cultures. In Sungchan Law's book, Many Colors, Cultural Intelligence for a Changing Church, he introduced and compared the characteristics of various cultures in chapter 4. He introduced various concepts about different cultures, such as primary versus secondary culture, hot and cold culture, high versus low context. Among those, hot and cold culture, relationship-based versus task-oriented, may explain two very different experiences and expectations on welcoming others that I am going to share. Let me share Jacob's story. Jacob described himself as a white American gay male church musician. When we asked Jacob about his church visit experiences as a visiting worshiper, he said he would not expect any warm welcome or interaction with church members. Jacob said he simply went to church to attend the worship service and left right after the service ended, which is quite normal in his church. The church buildings that he grew up in usually didn't have a church lobby or fellowship hall for gathering, and people also didn't expect to have fellowships with others before or after the service. Jacob said if someone greeted him and asked personal questions at a new church, he may feel intimidated and uncomfortable. He rather wanted to be left alone at the church. I personally have very different experiences from Jacob's story. One day I visited a Korean immigrant church in North Chicago. Even from the parking lot, I was surrounded by church members. Before I asked, people led me to the church building and showed me where the sanctuary, restroom, and fellowship hall were. They informed me that there would be a lunch gathering and asked me to stay for the gathering after the service. During the service, a church member sitting beside me, shoulder to shoulder, helped me find the hymn pages, Bible, and then bulletin. During the lunch gathering after the service, I was sitting with several church members on one table. They brought me silverware, drinks, and food, though the lunch was in buffet style. They wanted to show me hospitality by sitting with me, serving food, and asking personal questions. Though I felt a bit intimidated, I appreciated their effort in welcoming a one-time visitor. Because I know serving food and having personal conversations are some of the most important things in hospitality in Korean culture.
Knowing and understanding different cultures is not easy, but could be fun and worth the effort. However, when we talk about different cultures or engage with people from different backgrounds, people seem to avoid uncomfortable and difficult topics. This can lead to superficial relationships. In order to build genuine relationships, we need to be brave enough to scratch below the surface and embody the theology of the incarnation, which is to be present for another in a real way. In our context, that means talking about things that are difficult and uncomfortable.
Amy was born in an Asian country, educated in England and the US. After she earned her doctoral degree in the US, she was hired at a church in the US. One day, she was practicing organ to prepare the music for the coming Sunday, and a couple of visitors came into the church building. To show her personal hospitality to those visitors, she stopped practicing, came to the visitors, and introduced herself to them. She let them know her name, her position at the church, and her home country, which is not China. Right after hearing Amy's introducing herself, one of the visitors responded, "So, you're Chinese. You must be here to look for an American husband." Amy reported this issue to church leaders, and one of the leaders said, "Be grateful that at least you were not attacked." The church's follow-up action was to let her lock the door when she was practicing. First, she was frustrated by the verbal abuse from the visitors. And second, she was saddened by the church leaders' responses and reaction to the situation. Her wish was for her church leaders to do was to listen to her, pray for her, and make a kind of church statement against racism. Even when we interviewed Amy, it took a while for Amy to be able to open up, and we could see that she was uncomfortable while she was telling the story. She had said that she never told that story to anyone because she was never asked. We live in a culture when oftentimes when we were asked, "How are you?" we are almost always expected to say, "Fine," and life goes on. Checking in with our friends, asking the question, "How are you doing?" and staying to listen to the answer can open up conversations that are often deemed difficult. This can be an important step to walking alongside one another and being present for each other. This is what we meant by embodying the theology of the incarnation. So then, what is the role of music in all this? How can we use music to reconcile, welcome, and embrace people from different cultures?
And now music. Does it really have the power to unite people? Music is a great medium for storytelling. In worship, we tell God's stories through the music that we offer. When we often forget is through the process of learning musical pieces, we also learn about the composers and text writers' stories. We amplify the voices of these composers, and we practice empathy when we portray the emotion of these pieces. We can highlight other culture stories through music by offering music written by composers of diverse cultural experiences and countries. In recent years, church music leaders are putting a lot of effort into publishing resources that include global Christian music and songs written by various composers other than European composers.
Jacob shared with us that when he first took on his current position, he realized that most of the anthems in his choir library were mostly written by only deceased white European composers, and there was not much diversity in the music that they sing. While these are great and wonderful composers who wrote great music, Jacob realized that repertoire diversity was needed in order for others to experience their types of music and give voice to more diverse composers and text writers. This will not only amplify those composers' voices, but also serve to reflect the wealth of God's universal church. It is part of our stewardship as church musicians. Though we encourage you to use global Christian songs more, at the same time, we should know that unfamiliar musical styles and foreign languages in global music could make congregations an audience rather than an actively engaged worshippers. To prevent this problem, we need to inform and educate congregants. One of the most effective ways to help congregants is by giving them written or verbal information about the music, such as program notes or brief columns or articles in the church bulletins or newsletters.
Selecting diverse musical selections is especially encouraged for those who have the privilege of working with children. Teaching our children songs that reflect the universal church, including God's command to be kind to one another and those who look different, can be detrimental to the way that they grow up to treat others. Children are always watching and listening, and we need to be good models on how to tell stories of and interact with people who come from a different background and cultures from ours. Music also gives us a platform for minority musicians, not only to share their voices, but also to become leaders. That will show younger minorities that people who look like them can be in the position of leadership and thrive in this ministry platform as well. Another way to involve minority members in your church is to encourage people who come from different countries of origins to share their unique gifts, such as composing a piece for your choir, teaching hymns or chants in their native languages, arranging hymns in the style that is unique to their culture's traditional music, and so on. When I was in college, the college organist, who was also the chair of the worship committee at the time, often asked international students, myself included, to offer songs in their native language or play their traditional instruments for worship services in the chapel. The same person was also the director of the choir I was in, and she asked me to arrange an original Indonesian hymn for a choir. Of course, this experience was a significant one for me personally, because not only did I thrive in this field because of her empowerment, but she also inspired me to foster the same kind of empowerment to my own choir members and students.
Among other ministries, group music making, such as singing in a choir or playing in a handbell group, creates an environment where everyone has to work as a team. This teamwork requires us to connect with one another at another level through making and maintaining eye contact, breathing together, and careful listening. The goal is always to unite members of our ensemble over the piece that we work on at a given time. We bring this exercise to the congregation every time we do congregational singing, with the ultimate goal of offering our gifts with one voice. Especially, speaking of members of ethnic minorities, music ministry can provide the opportunity to share and celebrate their voices and representation of their diversity of Christ Church. Additionally, the platform of music ministry presents the opportunity for others to learn about a minority member's culture through the lens of empathy and emotional, even spiritual expression in the music that they learn and share. Consequently, this can create stronger bonds and connections among all members of the choir and the congregation.
And now, so what? What should we do? What can we do? The more that we listen to other stories, the more we learn that storytelling and careful listening are such huge catalysts for relationship building and understanding among people who may look different at first. As we have heard in our interviewees and our own stories, we not only learn about each other when we tell each other stories about ourselves, but we develop trust through these interactions. Fostering a safe environment in the choir room and allowing time during rehearsals for choir members to get to know each other can also be very encouraging for musicians to get to know those with whom they do not usually hang out. Our interviewee, Jacob, shared that at the beginning of his choir rehearsals, he would ask his singers to greet the person they do not know very well. Similarly, one of the choir directors I had worked with always began each month with us sharing one non-musical thing that others may not know. Anthony shared with us that he always set aside time for sharing joys and concerns each week at his choir rehearsals. These interactions can act as a model on how we can get to know others in our congregation and community, especially those who are new.
We have to force ourselves to listen to others, or we have to work hard to help others share their own stories. Otherwise, we will never know what's in people's hearts. For example, Pastor Nick, also a pseudonym, shared a story about two people in his congregation, one white and one black, who worked at the same workplace for many years and were assumed to have the same experience at their work. However, after the black person came with a new car to his workplace, he was asked if he was drug stealing on the side, while the other person, white person, was never questioned when he got his new car. These two co-workers and Nick, the pastor himself, would have not learned about each other's stories and the racism that was underneath it, or if they would not have this casual storytelling time during fellowship time. As a host or a choir director, we can foster a judgment-free environment where others can feel safe, sharing more about themselves. We can create a space for people to talk about themselves by asking them to tell their own stories, such as what they are passionate about, what their favorite music or sports are. Anthony brought up an important point that extending our hand for a handshake can mean a lot in showing that you are comfortable having physical contact with someone. Nowadays, of course, physical contact like handshaking is not recommended in this pandemic situation. However, we can still say hello, make eye contact, and give a big smile to others. And if someone is not fluent in English, we can be patient and carefully listen to them without interrupting or correcting their English. Look for the things you have in common. These commonalities can encourage us to embrace the diversity of God's creation. We also learned that knowing our biases can help us refrain from projecting the stereotypes we often associate with certain groups or races. Many of the stories shared in our interviews show that sometimes people make comments that are stereotypical and can be hurtful to whom the words are directed. What we say matters, and we need to be aware of our implicit bias. This awareness can help us stop ourselves before we react to certain situations and discern whether or not our action is influenced by our bias. Many of us also use devotional times during rehearsals, staff meetings, or worship committee meetings. During these times, we can include topics that have been labeled difficult conversation subjects, or consistently remind people that this is a safe zone. Knowing that they are safe will encourage people to openly talk about issues that others may deem difficult to talk about. Devotional times also center us in the scriptures, and this will allow us to also focus on God's word about such subjects.
And most importantly, we also learn that everyone is unique. This is what's so cool about God's creation, that God made each of us different, but still in God's own image. Our interviews demonstrate this very thing. When we asked each interviewee how they would identify themselves, their descriptions about themselves were varied. Even though some of them may look similar in presentation or skin color, the things that matter to them were very different. This teaches us that even people who come from the same country or of the same ethnicities do not identify, think, or act in the same way. Last but not least, while most of our suggestions and ideas are done inside the church building or our own ministry, we must not forget that the church is not a building. The church is God's people, the body of Christ. Therefore, extending our welcome outside of the building is also important. Seeking collaboration with other churches or community groups in our area can unite people in a way that we may not imagine. We heard in Sam's story that he sent personal invitations to churches and people in his communities to collaborate on his virtual choir project of a hymn in 3 different languages. And the result was quite profound. I had also combined my music ministry and others from across the globe for a reading of the Pentecost story that was orchestrated to mimic what might have happened in the upper room. There was something about seeing people from across the communities and globe, for that matter, coming together to tell God's story, and in many ways, we can see the Spirit working in a very unique way.
The New Testament repeatedly emphasizes that the Christian community is a unity in diversity. Music is, in so many ways, a unifying factor in the church. Music brings people together from different walks of lives and vocations who would not have been likely to meet or spend time together. A part of the church's greater ministry, the music ministry, has a place in planting, nurturing, and sharing this agape love from the small community of musical ensembles to the family of faith within their congregation, to the neighborhood where they reside, and to every person with whom they meet in the world.
Thank you so much for that incredibly wonderful and insightful presentation. I am not seeing any questions in the chat, but if someone wants to write something in the chat, please do so. I would just like to say, I was very struck by some of the words that kept coming up again and again: relationship, story, listening, identity. And in particular, I was struck that you asked people to identify themselves without imposing your assumptions on them about who they were. I wonder if you could say a little more about that. And you're both muted, so.
Can you hear me well?
Yes, I can hear you now.
Yeah, when we conducted this project, there was one same keyword that every interviewee talked about. It was listening. So we learned that storytelling and listening carefully to others make deeper relationship rather than one event of welcoming. So welcoming, I believe that welcoming is the mandatory step that we have to take. But at the same time, the welcoming is the beginning step where we should move forward. So without having a relationship, it's still like introducing ourselves, like our names and vocations. It's quite superficial, but making deeper relationship means getting to know each other better, and then taking care of each other also. So that's why I think we keep saying the relationship over and over.
There was There is one question that we'll ask, and I think we're going to have to stop because our time is running out, but this is from Sarah Johnson in Vancouver. It says, thank you for doing this qualitative research and sharing these stories. One of the gifts of qualitative research is the creation of space to share stories anonymously. What is your sense of how a commitment to anonymity shaped how participants spoke into these questions? And are there other ways to create safer spaces for openly sharing stories about welcome and the absence of welcome?
I think I can probably answer to that. When we interview our interviewees, we ask them to consent first, and we assure them that we will use pseudonyms or a fake name when we share their stories. And if at any time they feel uncomfortable that somebody might find out who they are, we have said that we will delete their interview videos, because we also recorded all of them for our own purposes as we're writing the script. So far, that is the measure that we have. And I think a lot of the interviewees felt pretty safe that they shared pretty openly. We've checked with them whenever we wanted to write something that might be traumatic to them or might be exposing of them. So that's how we have tried to protect their anonymity.
Well, thank you both so much for this very wonderful session. I think we learned a lot from hearing the diversity of stories, from your methodology, from your own way of listening to people. I think that also was a great model for all of us. So it's been a great contribution to our conference this week, which has dealt with so many of these same threads, but in a really different, from a different perspective. Thanks very much. And to all of you who are watching, if you're a full conference registrant, there's opportunity for an informal hangout in about 30 minutes at 1:30 Eastern. And then at 3 o'clock Eastern, we have the roundtable forum led by former Hymn Society President John Thornburg on the Hymn Society's second century and your dreams for what that second century might look like. And then finally, our closing festival tonight with Tony Alonso, which ought to be really wonderful and joyful celebration. That's at 7 p.m. Eastern. And then everybody, even if you don't think you're a member of the Hymn Society, if you registered for this conference, you became a member of the Hymn Society. And tomorrow at noon Eastern time will be our annual meeting, which is not as boring as it sounds. It's actually, those are actually quite fun and interesting. So you'll be receiving information about that if you haven't already. So thank you very much to our presenters, and thanks to all of you for being here today. Goodbye.